There is a courtroom in Maricopa County where, this spring, a judge picked up a pen and quietly rewrote the future of thousands of Arizona homes that do not exist yet. No cameras rolled. No press conference was called. There was just a ruling, filed and forgotten by almost everyone except the people whose livelihoods depend on knowing exactly what it means. And on the other side of that ruling sat two very different versions of Arizona, standing close enough to shake hands, but living by completely different rules. In one of them, the taps are locked, the paperwork is frozen, and an entire category of homes simply cannot be built until someone higher up says otherwise. In the other, a handful of small towns spent 9 years and the better part of $250 million quietly buying their way out of the exact same drought that is strangling their neighbors 3 miles down the road. This is the story of what happens when a state tries to unban its own housing boom in the middle of the biggest groundwater fight in its history, and the 9 communities standing in exactly the spot where that decision lands. Some of them saw it coming and paid to get out of the way. Some of them are still waiting to find out if an appeals court is going to save them or bury them. Before we start counting these down, here is a preview of what is ahead. You're going to meet a town that wrote a $244 million check to guarantee its own water for the next 100 years, while its neighbors were still filling out forms. You're going to see the exact legal mechanism the state used to freeze an entire ring of subdivisions almost overnight, and the equally quiet ruling this year that cracked that freeze back open. And you're going to find out about a backlog of 80,000 homes sitting in a kind of legal limbo. Already approved, already promised water, just waiting for construction crews who may or may not still be building by the time this is sorted out. If you're the kind of person who reads the fine print before signing a mortgage in this state, this is exactly the channel for you. Subscribe now, because most of Arizona has not caught up yet to what this ruling actually changes, and by the end of this video, you will understand it better than most of the people selling houses here. Do it before the appeal gets decided, and this whole conversation moves again. Let's start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without the moment the ground rules changed. And it changed faster than almost anyone living in these 9 places actually noticed at the time. Picture it from the outside for a second, the way an out-of-state buyer would see it scrolling listings at midnight. A row of nearly identical stucco houses on a nearly identical street. Price tag comfortably under what you would pay back home. Palm trees, a pool, 3 bedrooms, move-in ready. Nothing in that listing tells you whether the town underneath it spent 9 years and $250 million locking down its water, or whether it is currently 3 months away from finding out if an appeals court is going to let it keep building at all. Same listing format, same photos. Completely different 100-year outlook. That gap between what the listing shows you and what the hydrology report actually says is the entire subject of this video. Back in 2023, Arizona did something almost no fast-growing state in the country had ever done. It told developers working the outer ring of Metro Phoenix that they could no longer build new subdivisions relying on groundwater alone. Not a gentle nudge, not a fee increase, an actual stop sign, backed by the state's own hydrology. Officials had run the long-range math and found a gap of roughly 4.9 million acre-feet between what the aquifer could realistically keep giving over the next 100 years and what continued unchecked growth would demand from it. An acre-foot, for reference, is enough water to cover an entire acre of land a foot deep, and it is roughly what 2 to 3 American households use in a year. Multiply that shortfall out across a century, and you get a number so large it stops sounding like a housing statistic and starts sounding like a geological problem. The restriction did not hit Arizona evenly. It landed hardest on a specific ring of towns on the fast-growing edges of the valley, the ones that had built their entire economic identity around cheap land stacked on top of cheap groundwater. 2 of those towns, Buckeye and Queen Creek, became the public face of the new rule almost immediately, name-checked in the governor's own announcement. A separate, older version of the same restriction had already been quietly running in Pinal County since 2021, 2 full years before the Phoenix area rule even existed, which means some of these towns have been living under some form of water rationing on paper for the better part of 5 years now. Then, this past April, a Maricopa County Superior Court judge struck down a key piece of the enforcement mechanism the state had been relying on, a standard known informally as the unmet demand rule. The judge found it illegal and blocked the Department of Water Resources from using it to determine whether developers had secured their required 100-year water supply. Predictably, one side called it a long overdue correction to an overreaching bureaucracy that had strangled housing supply in one of the fastest-growing markets in the country. The other side called it a dangerous crack in the only real safeguard standing between short-term growth and long-term water security. The Department of Water Resources has said it intends to appeal. As of right now, today, the legal ground underneath Arizona's biggest housing restriction in a generation is still actively moving beneath everyone's feet. That is exactly the kind of detail that will never show up on a real estate listing, a walkthrough video, or a glossy brochure for a new, master-planned community. It shows up here. Let's count down the 9 places currently living with the consequences, starting with the ones playing defense the longest, and ending with the number that actually explains every single one of them. Number 9. Casa Grande. Casa Grande sits inside the Pinal Active Management Area, one of the 2 regions in this state where groundwater-based subdivisions have been restricted since 2021, a full 2 years before the rest of the Phoenix area ever felt the pinch. Developers here did not have the luxury of waiting around to see how a court case in Maricopa County might eventually shake out. They adapted years ago, and the adaptation tells you almost everything you need to know about how creative a housing market gets when the water simply is not there. A meaningful share of new construction in and around Casa Grande shifted toward build-to-rent communities, entire subdivisions engineered from the ground up to be leased instead of sold, partly because that structure sidesteps some of the assured water supply requirements that apply to traditional for-sale subdivisions. When an entire local economy quietly restructures itself around a legal loophole, that loophole has stopped being a curiosity and started being the business model. And here is the part that makes this year's Maricopa County ruling almost irrelevant to Casa Grande specifically. The older Pinal County restriction is a separate legal animal entirely. Whatever happens on appeal to the newer Phoenix area rule, Casa Grande's rulebook does not automatically change with it. Number 8. Maricopa. Not to be confused with Maricopa County itself, the city of Maricopa sits in that same Pinal groundwater zone, under that same 2021-era restriction, staring down that same unresolved 100-year supply gap. What makes this city worth a closer look is not the court case at all. It is the sheer length of the runway. Maricopa has had close to 5 years now to adjust to a future in which its own state has been telling it, on the record, that the growth cannot continue indefinitely on the water it currently has. 5 years is long enough for a market to fully absorb bad news, price it in, and settle into a new equilibrium, or long enough for a slow leak to finally show up as a visible crack. Either way, this is the honest, unglamorous version of the story. A commuter town that has known for half a decade exactly what its long-term water ceiling looks like, with no shadowy villain and no single dramatic headline, just a long, quiet adjustment playing out one closing at a time. Number 7. Buckeye was one of the 2 original names attached to the 2023 restriction, standing right alongside Queen Creek in the governor's own announcement. For years leading up to that moment, Buckeye had been one of the fastest growing cities, not just in Arizona, but in the entire country. A sea of new rooftops spreading across what used to be open Sonoran desert, built on the simple promise of cheap land and room to grow forever. That promise ran directly into the same hydrology report that reshaped everyone else's plans. Unlike Queen Creek, Buckeye has not spent the years since assembling its own alternative water portfolio at anything close to the same scale. It has largely been in a holding pattern, waiting to see whether the courts hand the door back open on groundwater the way it used to work, or whether it will need to find its own version of Queen Creek's playbook. Right now, Buckeye is a city built for a growth rate it may not be legally allowed to sustain, sitting one appellate ruling away from finding out which future it actually gets. Number 6. Queen Creek. Here is the twist nobody sees coming after 5 straight entries of towns playing defense. Queen Creek is the one place on this entire list that essentially opted out of the crisis altogether by writing checks large enough to buy its way clear of it. Since 2018, the town has been methodically assembling water rights from outside its own basin, starting with an agreement to acquire Colorado River water tied to Cibola farmland, roughly 200 miles away, then expanding into a much larger purchase from the Harquahala groundwater basin west of Phoenix. All told, Queen Creek has committed somewhere in the neighborhood of $244 million toward a stated goal of a fully secured, locked-in 100-year water supply that does not depend on the same shrinking aquifer everyone else on this list is fighting over. The town began receiving its first Colorado River transfer back in 2023, delivering water that used to irrigate a few hundred acres of farmland to thousands of households instead, and it has continued layering in additional Harquahala purchases through 2025 and into 2026. Queen Creek is not sitting around waiting for an appeals court to decide its future. It already left the table, and it left with a receipt for $250 million to prove it. Quick pause before we go further, because the next 4 entries get more personal than the first 5. If you're finding this useful, tap the like button now. It genuinely helps more people see these breakdowns before they sign somewhere they will regret. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment, because the second half of this list is where the story stops being about policy and starts being about what it actually feels like to live inside it. Number 5. Goodyear. On the western edge of that same restricted zone as Buckeye, Goodyear occupies a genuinely strange middle position, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it undercuts the simple story this whole countdown could otherwise tell. Parts of Goodyear are old enough to already carry pre-2023 water supply commitments locked in before the freeze ever took effect, meaning those neighborhoods are functionally insulated from everything we have just described. Other parts, the newer western parcels still being platted and sold today, are exposed to exactly the same restriction as everyone else on this list, which means Goodyear is not really one city for the purposes of this story. It is two cities occupying the same municipal boundary, one grandfathered into security and one waiting on the same appeal as its neighbors. And the only way to know which one you are actually buying into is to ask which side of an invisible, decades-old paperwork line your specific subdivision happens to fall on. Number 4. Surprise. Further northwest, Surprise offers a quieter, second-order version of this same pressure, and it is arguably the most instructive entry on this entire list, precisely because nothing dramatic has happened here yet. This is not one of the headline moratorium cities. It is a growth-dependent municipal budget, quietly absorbing what happens when the certificate pipeline for new subdivisions slows down without stopping outright, when cautious lenders and cautious buyers start pricing in a risk that used to be invisible. 2 decades of steady, compounding growth built an entire local economic model, city services, school funding projections, retail development, all of it calibrated to an assumption that the pipeline of new certified subdivisions would simply keep flowing at the pace it always had. Surprise is the answer to a question most of the more dramatic entries on this list never quite get around to asking. What does the slow version of this crisis actually look like before it becomes a headline? Number 3. Eloy sits inside that same Pinal Active Management area, and it carries some of the starkest physical evidence of long-term groundwater overdraft found anywhere in this state, evidence that predates this entire legal fight by generations. Decades of sustained pumping here have been documented through measurable, gauged land subsidence, the slow, uneven sinking of the ground itself as the aquifer beneath it compacts under the weight of everything still standing on top of it. This is not a new phenomenon triggered by a 2023 rule or a 2026 court case. It is a decades-old geological record of exactly what unmanaged groundwater extraction does to a landscape over enough time, and it sat there quietly accumulating long before anyone in a courtroom in Maricopa County ever argued about the word unmet. Eloy belongs on this list as a reminder that the current legal fight over certificates and appeals, as consequential as it is really just the newest layer sitting on top of a much older, much slower moving problem. Number 2. Santan Valley unincorporated and still growing fast. Santan Valley sits in an unusual position because it is not just watching a court case play out from a distance. It is currently watching 2 different water utilities, EPCOR and the town of Queen Creek, actively present competing long-term supply plans to its own residents in real time, most recently at a council session late last year. This is, in a very real sense, a preview of where several of the other entries on this list may eventually end up. A community forced to actively choose between competing water futures rather than simply inheriting whichever plan its home city government happens to have already committed to. Santan Valley does not have the luxury of assuming its water story has already been decided for it. It is being decided right now, in public meetings, by residents who have to weigh 2 different pitches from 2 different providers before they can even answer the basic question of where their water is going to come from a decade from now. Number 1. the 80,000 homes stuck in the backlog. Not a single town, the actual headline running underneath every single entry on this list. When the 2023 restriction first landed, state officials were careful to point out that it was not a total shutdown. Roughly 80,000 already approved homes across the restricted zone still had a legal path forward because they had locked in their assured water supply certificates before the cutoff date. 80,000 homes, already blessed by the state, already promised water, sitting in a kind of legal purgatory between approval and completion while everything around them keeps shifting. That backlog is the real fault line running underneath this entire story. The actual dividing line that separates every city on this countdown into two categories: the subdivisions that got their paperwork stamped in time, and the ones still waiting to find out whether an appeal is going to reopen the door or seal it shut for good. Step back far enough and a pattern emerges across all 9 of these places that no single headline quite captures on its own. The cities that treated water as a strategic asset worth spending real money on, the way Queen Creek did, are the ones that walked away from this legal fight almost entirely untouched by it. The cities that treated water as a background assumption, something that had simply always been there and would presumably keep being there, are the ones now waiting on an appellate court to tell them what their next decade looks like. That is not a coincidence, and it is not really a story about drought either. It is a story about which local governments started asking the hard question early, and which ones are still asking it now, under pressure, with a lot less room to maneuver than they had 5 years ago. None of this means Arizona is drying up overnight, and it does not mean every home in these 9 places is automatically a bad bet. Governor Katie Hobbs herself was careful to say, back when the original restriction was announced, that nobody who already has water is going to lose it. What all of this does mean is that how many square feet and how many bedrooms have quietly stopped being the only questions worth asking before you buy property anywhere in this state. The real question, the one this year's court ruling just reopened without most people noticing, is whether the water underneath the listing you are looking at is guaranteed outright, tangled up in an active legal dispute, or sitting inside an appeal that nobody has finished arguing yet. If you're seriously weighing a move to any of these 9 places, there is exactly one document worth asking for that most buyers never think to request. Not the inspection report, not the HOA disclosures, the certificate. Ask whether the property you're looking at already has its 100-year assured water supply locked in before the 2023 cutoff, or whether it is still sitting somewhere in that 80,000 home backlog, waiting on an appellate court to decide what happens next. That is the first Arizona water story most people have not caught up to yet, and there are more fault lines running underneath this state than most house hunters currently realize.